All right, take it away.
All right, sounds good. Can everyone hear me? All right, perfect. Good, bad, ugly, terrible? Good, perfect. So first thing I'm going to answer is really, why did I start using Docker? Like a lot of things in my life, it kind of boils down to there was a game that I wanted to play and I couldn't play it anyway else. So essentially, it's a MUD. MUDs are an old school way of playing like World of Warcraft or Final Fantasy. It's kind of like those games, but more reading, I guess I would say. I put an asterisk next to popular because I thought they were pretty cool, but popular, yeah, maybe not. And so here's a screenshot. This was taken yesterday. So this is one of the actual games. The address is there. You can try it out if you'd like to, but essentially you log in, there's different commands and directions you can do. It's pretty fun. A lot more open-ended than a lot of games are these days. No grinding for the sake of grinding. So, but what's the connection? So really the connection is there was a lot of things that just wouldn't work on modern hardware and software. Most of these are from mid 1990s is generous. Some of them are like late 80s, mid 80s, and just finding a way to run those on anything that doesn't have a 90 in the date is just almost impossible. And so 32-bit wasn't like an option, it was the only thing they had. So that's kind of the connection between Docker and the games that I was trying to run. So what is Docker? This is from their website. It essentially lets you separate the applications from the infrastructure that they're developed with. And so what the heck does that mean? Essentially, it allows you to run the infrastructure in small pieces called containers. Container is essentially a virtual machine that has a single use, a single thing that it does. And so different containers, a lot of companies will do like their database in a container, maybe their web server in a container. Yeah. And so looking at Docker, how do you do it? First thing I would recommend is Docker Desktop. For students and companies making less than $10 million, it's free. So it's nice to be able to jump in, lots of practice. There are a couple things you need to pay attention to, especially if you have a Mac. They have different versions for Intel chips versus Mac chips. But yeah, it's just a standard installer. And then for those who use WSL2, it has built-in integration that's very easy to use. Once you install Docker, it's in their settings menu. You just click that, and somehow the commands just work. It's pretty much it. And so there's a couple different pieces to Docker. There's three main pieces. There's a Docker file, there is an image, and there's a class. And so the best way to relate that would be a Docker file would be like the Ruby file on your computer. Main.rb would be the Docker file. The image is like the class. The image is a template that gives you everything that you need to do. And then the container would be the object that you actually create. And so Docker file allows you to create an image, and then you use that by building a container. And so one thing I wanted to point out is Docker files work off of a build context, and the build context is set by this little dot right here. It's essentially everything in the directory you are in and up. And so that can be good and bad. You want to try to narrow that down as much as you can, because everything in that context is used and loaded when you build your container. So if you add it to just the base home directory of your Linux distro, you're going to have a really slow, large Docker build. And so here's some of the basic commands that you would use inside of a Docker file. The first one, and probably the most important, is from. Essentially, this is how you tell it what your base image is going to be. There are base images for a lot of different things. You'll see here, I like Ubuntu 22.04 because it's pretty modern and it has a lot of the old dependencies that I needed. So you can find pretty much any flavor you want. I've seen OpenSUSE, I've seen Debian, just pretty much everything. Run is, it's basically how you do stuff inside of the container or image itself. And so this would be like you pulling up your command prompt or your shell and typing in a command. That's exactly what run is. One thing I'll say here that I haven't put yet is inside of the Docker file script, you want to do quiet commands, which means commands that don't ask you to press any buttons. So a lot of times you'll go to install something and it's like, this will take 100 megabytes. Do you want to continue? That will actually kill your Docker build because no one can press the button. So with run, there's a couple ways to actually run the commands. I almost exclusively use the shell form, and it's literally run, and then you just type it out like you would if you were typing out a shell command. Exec form, if you've taken operating systems, you probably recognize it because a lot of commands do it that way as well. So expose, this is for when you need outside connectivity to your container. So this is a port and then a technology or protocol that you would open it up to. This I've seen mainly for like web servers and Postgres and things like that. Next is going to be copy. This is how you get a file from your build context into the image itself. And so as far as this, I'm going to have documentation links at the bottom. I'm also going to share this at the end. So if you want PowerPoint, you can certainly have it. More instructions. There's really not that many. This is pretty much it. Add is essentially the exact same thing as copy, but you can actually use URLs. And so if there's a web file that you want to get, you can use add instead. Copy is the preferred method of getting files from your computer or from a location into the image, but it doesn't work with URLs. So workdir, this is essentially the same as typing change directory. So once you type this command in, any other run commands that you do will be from that specific location. And then one other utility piece about this is the last workdir that you set into the actual Docker file is where you will be put when you log into the Docker file. And so if there's a specific location you want to be in, such as like, say, a specific class folder, instead of just being thrown into root or into the root directory or home directory, you can set that there. And then I haven't used this one much or really at all, but volume is how you essentially create external storage connected to a Docker file. So there's some related files that I haven't really needed to get into much, just because most of the stuff I've done has been with like specific build environments and using it from an IDE and not necessarily connecting more than one thing together. But Docker ignore is very similar to git ignore. You can put in specific folders in here and they will be ignored from your build context. And so this is a way to not only speed up your builds, but also decrease the size. And then Docker compose is, it's interesting. It becomes a command within Docker as well. And it essentially lets you start and stop and bring up more than one container at once. So as far as Dockerfile, this isn't the most simple example, but it's pretty simple. You have literally your image, and then you have a couple commands that you can run. And that will essentially create the class for you that you can use from there. The -y flag, that is to get apt to run quietly. Here's a little bit more advanced, but it doesn't change that much. Essentially, you have your image. Labels are dictionaries, essentially, and they just allow you to add metadata to a Docker file or a Docker image. You'll see a couple run commands. You'll see a couple make directories, setting the work directory, expose. Pretty much it. Yeah.
I'm just curious. You could do run CD as an alternative to the directory?
Yeah. So question was, can you do run CD as an alternative to work directory? You certainly can. It's probably better to use work directory, and I'll explain why here in a little bit.
Thank you.
Yep. As far as the images, this is probably the best place to go for them. There's some of these images that have been downloaded literal billions of times, such as Ubuntu, Postgres, Redis. This is their official category or catalog of various base images you can use. And with that, here's some of the command line interface commands you can use. Docker build, this is what you use to get a Docker file to become an image. It's literally Docker build, and then you set the build context. Common flags, -f. If you have a Docker file that's in a different place than the directory you're in that you want to run, that's the flag you would use. -t is a way to tag a Docker image. I've used this a little bit, mainly to make it easy to run containers later. But if you're developing a specific container, this would be kind of version control for that. There's quite a few more commands for builds, so take a look at that. This Docker create is where you go from an image to a container. This is like using the new keyword in Ruby. And so that's pretty much it. Basically Docker create and then the name of the image that you've done. As far as another command, Docker start. Once the container is created, this is how you get it up and running. Docker stop is not start. Docker PS is how you see a list of, by default, running containers, and then you can use the -a flag to see every container on your computer. And then this is what I found very helpful is IDE integration. I specifically use VS Code with Docker, and it works really, really, really well. JetBrains has integration as well. I haven't played around with it very much, but it's there. There's a couple extensions on VS Code that you can use. There's an official Docker extension, and then I think it's called Remote Explorer is another one, and that lets you literally connect into the Docker container from VS Code directly. And then here's some of the things that I found out just from using Docker. Learn from my pain, please. But the main thing, and the answer to the second part of your question, is the run command is completely encapsulated in and of itself. And so if you have maybe 2 or 3 commands that are interrelated, you need to find a way to put them into one run line in the Docker file. Some examples of this would be like SSH keys. You have to basically start the SSH agent and then put the key into there. But if you do that in 2 separate run lines, the second line that you do where you actually insert the key, the agent isn't running anymore because it's completely separate. Another thing I found is that just in general, secrets are hard with Docker. It's something I haven't quite cracked yet in a way that I really like. Some things I've done is like link the SSH folder into the context and then copy the keys, but I don't like that from a security standpoint, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend it for like a company you're working with. They have some more like, I would say, commercial or business solutions that use Swarm and some other technologies, but not anything that's really super easy or super useful for students. The other thing is with Docker, it's meant to be as lightweight of a container as possible. And so by default, you don't get any help files at all. None. Like not even on the man command. So this is 22.04 for Ubuntu, and it gives you an option to install them. That's, as you can see, it's pretty easy. Not every base image is as forgiving. So if you need documentation, I'd look that out. As far as my information, here's some of my base info. I'm pretty much all over the OSU Cascades Tech Club Discord. I don't ever check my email, so if you send me something, I can't guarantee anything there. And then there's my GitHub. Anyone have any other questions?
When you're using that from command, is like you is that image installing the computer, or is Docker installing it from there, like,
so what they do is they download it from their Docker Hub, and then when they spin it up, they actually install it into the container itself. Containers, they're in a weird and kind of hard to find place unless you set up volumes for them. You can Google it. Probably page 3 or 4 is where you'll find exactly where they're installed, but it's essentially a virtual machine that has that image. Yeah.
When you're doing the Docker build, I know there's the F option, the dash F, and then you specify the path. And then if you have your dot, what's the purpose of the dot again?
Yeah. So the final dot in the build command is to set the build context. And so when you run it, I haven't played around with like setting that as a different folder, but the main thing is you want to be in a folder on your computer where all of the stuff is located, but in a location where it's small enough that it's not going to take forever to add everything into the building process.
And so then when you do the dash F option, it's going to make a link or something to your script or
kind of, it's like doing file open in like Microsoft Word or any of those programs. It's basically telling the command where the Docker file is located. Yep. All right, well, what I got.